Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria, joins me of course, to look at the African Development Bank's outlook for this year. Andrew, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's always wonderful to be here, Esther. Thank you.
So the African Development Bank says 4.1%. That's their projection for growth in Africa this year. 4.1%, not double-digit growth, but higher than what we've seen previously. But what are your thoughts in terms of what they took into consideration arriving at this growth projection, and how they feel that growth is going to take shape this year?
First, let's say I think that it's a fantastic report. I think the African Development Bank have done a very good job with the numbers, but also the analysis of what's behind it and what's important for Africa. I think our view would be the 4.1 number is probably pretty accurate. But we need to unpack a little bit to see what's going on, because of course Africa is a big place. Let's focus for this discussion on sub-Saharan Africa. So we have some real bright spots that are coming out. Ethiopia at 8 or 9%, Kenya at 5%, our neighbor Ghana, English-speaking neighbor Ghana at over 6%. Over 6% this year, and I think 8% in 2018. Ivory Coast is doing well. But the 4.1% is because there's some people dragging us down.
Interesting. But especially last year, we had the likes of the IMF mention, especially for a country like Nigeria, and even Ghana, to talk a lot about fiscal imbalances, and of course put in more fire to the diversification drive and all of that. So I'm thinking, is that also going to be, would that also be a focus this year, also perhaps for PwC too, what you will be watching in terms of how the government addresses, budget deficits, fiscal imbalances, revenues, especially for a country like Nigeria, revenue streams, and of course dealing with tensions in the Niger Delta to ensure that we keep production, up?
Well, the AfDB hits it on the head when they said the biggest fiscal issue is the tax policy, and across Africa collecting about 17% in tax. The number that they put out, that's what you need for revenue mobilization, is about 25% of GDP. Of course, here in Nigeria, we would be thrilled even with 17%. We're way behind that, 6 or 7%. PwC, as people know, has always been advocating for this. I think that message has got through to different levels of government, and there is a big mobilization, but we need it too, and we need to get from 6 or 7% up to 12, 15%, excluding oil, not always relying on oil revenue. And that is really going to help us in having enough resources for education and health, but also for the infrastructure parts that the government has to finance, because the private sector can't do it all. So that fiscal key, I think the AfDB's been exactly right. We really need in Africa, and certainly here in Nigeria, to stay focused on tax policy, making sure it's simple and that it's across the board. Everyone pays their taxes, because a business can't operate if one business is paying taxes, competitor is not.
But what is your assessment of how we've put it all together so far? We've had the VADES, the Voluntary Assets and Income Declaration Scheme, and the IFRS chief tells us that they've been able to rake in, at least last year, they were able to rake in a lot of money, but we still have so many people outside of the bracket. And I was speaking to an economist recently, and he says we actually took a little step in terms of tax to GDP ratio. It's actually not 6% anymore, it's actually 5% now. So I'm thinking, did we take a step back? But we had all this money coming in.
Well, I think that it was maybe 18 months ago that we started getting a focus on this, and unfortunately it's the type of thing that it takes a few years to get if you keep the focus on it. So if we take the example of Lagos, Lagos's IGR is 4 times as big as Rivers, the next state. It's almost 80% of the total revenue in Lagos, but it's taken Lagos a decade to get there with the focus. So I think the issue for the federal government and individual states is, okay, we've been thinking about it for 18 months, maybe 2 years now. The Minister of Finance talked about it. The Vice President's talking about it. We all know there's a lot of people not in the tax net who are wealthy and should be paying taxes. So if we keep the policy focus on it, so with the voluntary asset and income declaration, with the electronic filing, we'll get there over the next few years. But I take your point. Right now, we haven't seen the focus flow through yet to the Naira coming in the door yet. I guess
we have to give that some more time. What about issues around budgets? For Nigeria, for Ghana had that, was it 980 million plan, a partnership with the IMF, and I've spoken to a number of Ghanaian analysts, and they say that yes, it's gaining traction. And I think looking at Ghana's numbers, one could say that yes, Ghana has made a headway. But for this year, are you expecting
In terms of Nigeria's
Nigeria
budget deficit.
Okay.
So,
Ghana,
I think, is making progress. I mean, I remember when I was at the Africa CEO Forum and the president of Ghana was there speaking, he was so disappointed in 2016 that they only grew at 3.5%. So, you know, they're 4%, as I said, 6% this year, I think, 8% next year. Their budget deficit had widened out, but now it's coming back. It's about 4% budget deficit. With the growth, they'll get a little bit better. So they look on a good trajectory in Ghana. I think their diversification drive has gone well. I think they've got some oil, but we hope not so much that it ruins the country, perhaps the way it did Nigeria. It's just a little bit of an extra kind of buffer for them.
So it would do them good if they focus on it on just, you know, one of their streams of revenues.
But they already had cocoa, they already have other agriculture, so in a way, hopefully oil won't destabilize Ghana. So I think Ghana's on a fairly good trajectory. You know, with respect to Nigeria, I mean, we know we have a 2 trillion naira deficit. The deficit, we've always said, is largely due to the fact we don't collect the taxes. It's not because the government is spending too much. And in fact, this year, it's not going to spend everything it projected because a lot of the programs, the capital expenditures, are just simply not going to happen. But our deficit's only going to come down when we collect taxes.
What about a country like Cote d'Ivoire? I mean, we've always, you know, it's always been said that, I mean, it's had, you know, one of the fastest, you know, growing GDPs on the continent. But, you know, on the other hand, we talk about, you know, growth going along, you know, hand in hand with development, inclusive growth. I'm not sure that one, you know, sees that, but, you know, in terms of GDP growth, they have it.
Well, I think the AfDB has been very good at this report on focusing on that. I mean, we're really obsessed with GDP. I mean, we're talking 4%, 6%, 2%, et cetera. But we don't always know behind it what does it mean for the average person, for poverty levels. So in the AfDB report, for example, they say that it's an issue because the Gini coefficient increased. But how many people reading it know what the Gini coefficient is or how the Gini coefficient translates into poverty? So, but if we go back to 1990, 56% of Africans were in poverty. Now I think the number is around 43%. So that sounds like progress. The only problem is the absolute number of people in poverty has gone up. So we haven't made that much progress about it. And I think if the AfDB can change the debate so we're not so obsessed with just the raw GDP number, because rich people getting richer doesn't help anyone. But how is it translating into poverty reduction? And I think the other issue that people forget about is it's hard if you're wealthy and you're in the bracket that's earning over $100 a day, it's hard to distinguish between someone who's earning $1 and $10 a day. But actually that jump is massive. And if we could get better numbers on measuring it, we'll be more focused on actually, I mean, even if GDP didn't increase, but there were more people moving from $1 to $10.
Yeah, coming out of that poverty.
Some people moving from 150 to 100, that would be perfectly fine. So we need to get more focused on that. And AfDB is the right group to kind of change that debate. And maybe next year they'll bring out measurements that aren't so GDP focused. So
obviously at the heart of all of this also is, you know, inclusive growth, as it were. And I know that that's also going to be one of the focus, you know, on the agenda for the World Economic Forum in Davos this week, talking about how African countries, especially developing countries, should focus more on inclusive growth. And that touches on, you know, all spheres of what the government does, you know, whatever development programs, social and, you know, developmental programs, having people pay more taxes, you know, just focusing, pumping money into infrastructure. So I'm thinking, for you, what would you say that we're still not getting right as far as inclusive growth is concerned?
Well, you know, there's two sides to this, to growing the right way, the demand side and the supply side. On the supply side, I think our view is the education system needs to really strengthen the vocational training. We keep hearing everyone say we need to teach young entrepreneurs. We're not sure that's correct. I think we have a little bit of entrepreneur mania sometimes in Africa. I mean, the truth is...
Oh, I mean, they say it's the future of Africa now because there aren't any jobs.
Exactly, but the reason that they say go be an entrepreneur is because you can't get a job in a structured environment, right? And on the supply side, part of the issue is the skill set. So our view is that the continent needs a lot more vocational training. So these are skills like in the construction industry, masonry, electricians, auto mechanics, catering, things that are useful in the community, plumbing on that, and have certifications, small, not years and years, but 2 months certifications that build up over the time. But giving those skills is not that useful unless there's also a demand for it. So on the demand side, we still need to focus on the ease of doing business. We've been saying for a few months now that actually In this country, the #1 ease of doing business issue is land registry. Because if you don't know who owns a property, if you don't know you own the property, you're not going to invest in it. If the bank doesn't know you own the property, they're not going to give you a mortgage. If the securities industry doesn't know it, they're not going to securitize it. And it all starts with real estate. And if you think about, I mean, I'm Canadian, and my parents are immigrants from Africa, in fact. But when they arrived, they bought a house. That's what drove that kind of post-war, bought a house, 95% mortgage. The developer had access to finance. We knew we owned the house. There were plumbers and carpenters who could build the house. And so if the real estate sector doesn't work, I have a very hard time seeing the overall economy work. But it's never going to work without land registry. So if we have the supply side where we give some basic skills to people to participate in, and we have the demand side, which really starts with the real estate sector above all, we could see a lot more inclusive growth.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I mean, investment and in human capital, very key. But for this year, I mean, we have about 1 minute left. Are you optimistic, focusing on the Nigerian economy now, optimistic about on the Nigerian economy?
I mean, we've put out our view, which is the economy could grow at up to 4% if we kept really accelerating our policy reforms, but we don't think that's going to happen. We think the policy reforms are going to continue, but not faster, so we're predicting 2 to 3%. Is that good? I mean, our population is growing at 2.7%, so 2 to 3%, we're either still going a bit backwards or we're just treading water, so it's not good enough.
Andrew, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the show. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers.